We are here today with yet another presentation based on Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity. Now, in previous weeks, we explored the question why and how Christianity spread among different segments of Roman society, including upper classes, Hellenized Jews, and women. Today, we ask the question, where? Where did Christianity grow? And quite simply, what we find is that Christianity grew especially well in highly populated cities. This week, we're going to look at where and how they grew in cities. And next week, we'll talk more about why they grew in cities. Here we are mapping out the 22 largest cities in the Roman Empire in the year 100 in terms of population. Okay, now you see on the map that some of these places, some of these cities, the circle has now been filled in. And those are the cities, out of those 22 most populous cities in the Roman Empire, these are the cities that had a church by the year 100. You'll notice the proximity to Jerusalem. That makes sense. Most of them are closer to Jerusalem. We already talked about how the presence of Hellenized Jews were a major factor in the spread of Christianity. It turns out that Christianity was very likely to take hold in Roman cities where a synagogue was already present. Also, there were more Greek and Jewish influences on the cultures of the cities toward the west, or towards the east, excuse me. And where that was the case, they were more receptive to Christianity. Now in the west, as you got closer to Rome, they were less receptive. They were more anti-Christian, in large part because of Roman policy. So the cities that were more affected and more impacted by Roman policy were more antagonistic towards Christianity. Now, the city of Rome itself is a bit of an exception. It did have a church early on, and I'm thinking that's because it had a big target on it. It was Rome. It was the capital city. Its population was huge, 650,000 people, whereas most of these cities on this map were well under 200,000 or under 100,000, half of them. So Rome was huge, 650,000 people compared to these other cities in the empire. And the population of a city will make a big difference in the effect on Christianity growing, as you will see here shortly. Now, let's talk about travel for a moment. You may remember that Paul did a lot of traveling on boats, as many others did in his day. Travel in general was actually pretty common in those days. It's something I have a hard time wrapping my mind around in an age long before planes, trains, and automobiles. But Stark quotes Wayne Meeks as saying, "The people of the Roman Empire traveled more extensively and more easily than anyone before them did or would again until the 19th century." With the Roman highways the way they were and the sprawling empire the way it was, unified, one could very well travel from one end of the empire to the other in just one summer. I found it incredible to learn that it's estimated that the Apostle Paul traveled nearly 10,000 miles on his missionary journeys. That's 4 times the distance between Weirton and the west coast of America. And also, an archaeological dig in Phrygia found an inscription on a grave of a merchant that claimed to travel to Rome 72 times. So this guy made the trip from Phrygia to Rome. Phrygia is in that area around Ephesus that you see on the map. That distance is well over 1,000 miles. So we're talking over 75,000 miles of travel this one guy made in his lifetime back around AD 100. Stark also quotes Ramsay MacMullen, who said of the Roman Empire, it was a proper melting pot. If we imagine the British Empire of 140 years ago, all in one piece, all of its parts touching each other so that one could travel from Rangoon to Belfast without the interposition of any ocean, then we could thus sense as one whole an almost limitless diversity of tongues, cults, traditions, and levels of education, then the true nature of the Mediterranean world in the Roman era would strike our minds. So it is a consequence of increased travel that leads to increased networks. It leads to increased communication and increased contact between cultures, which set the stage perfectly for the missionaries like Paul. Not only could they get to a lot of different cities, but they also often had a pretty good understanding of what and who they would find when they got there. But on the flip side, those receiving and hearing the missionaries were to a great extent already familiar with Judaism, particularly the closer they were to Jerusalem, of course. Now, Stark states that people are more willing to adopt a religion to the extent that it retains cultural continuity with conventional religions with which they are already familiar. So all the more reason that these places with a synagogue, these places that are closer to Jerusalem, are familiar with Judaism or God-fearing people, they would be more ready to adopt Christianity. Just as a side note, if you really like looking at maps as I do, there's a really cool site put together by some folks at Stanford University. You can see a map of the ancient Roman world here. You can calculate travel times between various cities, even specifying things like the cheapest route, the fastest routes, what it's going to be like if you're going by donkey or by wagon or whatnot. It's like if you had Google Maps 2,000 years ago. Anyway, if you want to check that out, I will put a link in the description there for you. But it's pretty cool. If you don't care about that map, you might be grateful that a map of cheese exists to show you where a number of cheeses find their home all over the region. Of course, this only scratches the surface. Butter case isn't even on here. There's so many cheeses in the world. Anyway, I digress. Back to our map of church growth in the 22 most populous cities. So as time goes on, of course, churches are planted in more cities further away from Jerusalem. There we go. See, now we have even more circles colored in solid. So in the year 200, Christianity had spread to a few more of the cities further east, particularly along the Mediterranean. And as you will see here, some of the more eastern cities, and up north too, like London, they may not have had a church until closer to when the empire became more completely a Christian empire. So why cities? Why are they so great for Christianity to grow? Well, we'll get deeper into this in the next lesson, but for now, let's acknowledge that the more urban a place is, the higher the rates of unconventionality will be. In other words, the more people living in one place, the more people available to form a critical mass of deviant subculture, like deviant religious movements such as Christianity, which deviated from the religious norms of the day. Now, people in a more sparsely populated place, they're going to have a harder time finding others to deviate along with them, let alone there be enough of them to form that critical mass needed to gain momentum. To illustrate this, let's say that you have a really specific but unusual hobby, a hobby that deviates from the normal hobbies, right? Like playing a melodica. But so if you live in a crowded city and you put up posters looking for melodica players or people interested in melodicas to come and form a club, you're going to be a lot more likely to find other interested people because there's so many people. You might even have enough interest within close proximity to open up a little melodica shop and actually earn some profit because the population in your market area is so big and diverse. But let's say you don't live in a crowded city. Let's say you live out in the country or in a small town and you play the melodica and you want to start a club. It's going to take some work finding people who are interested at all. try opening up a store, and you're probably going to depend pretty heavily on online sales. Might have to end up closing. It might not work out so well. So, in general, there is a positive correlation demonstrated between the population of a city and how efficiently Christianity took hold. The cities in the Roman Empire were full of population turnover, instability, disorganization. They were crowded, they were chaotic, and this was the perfect recipe for the rise of Christianity. Next week, we will get a taste and perhaps a sniff of just what these cities were like. Take care.